Chapter 1. Impossible. The gearbox grated loudly as it sluggishly shifted down a gear. The driver manoeuvred the blue and white rusty bus around a sharp bend, and it soon began to accelerate as it hit a straight section of road, hotly followed by a plume of thick smog. Helen McQueen yawned, tired after a busy, arduous day, chasing around a hyperactive child, fueled by sugar and excitement. The sun was setting a beautiful pink as it kissed the horizon and reflected the same warm tone in the sea, making cold, conventional England look like an exotic paradise. She reached under the seat in front of her, picking up her oversized leather handbag, which was filled to the brim with all the necessary essentials for a day out at the zoo. She pulled out a true story puzzle magazine and started thumbing rigorously through the pages until she got to the section that was near the back.
"Oh, those things are dreadful, aren't they?"
said the woman sat next to her in a dry, monotone voice.
"Why people air their dirty laundry in public is beyond me."
This judgmental woman had a short bob haircut, and even though she had just spent the day out with her child, supposedly relaxing, still felt the need to wear a grey, stuffy pinstripe trouser suit. Helen had turned to the agony aunt column. Distressed souls shared their worries in a desperate hope that this one solitary woman would write back, magically giving them the answer to put their troubled lives back on track.
"Oh, I know, Eugenia. You can't do a simple crossword without someone moaning about something. It's just so sad,"
Helen said, not wanting to seem like a depraved vulture, picking over the tattered remains of someone's shattered life. She then turned back a few pages to a word jumble, pretending she had landed on the problem pages by accident. She pulled out a ballpoint pen and clicked it with a gratuitous amount of pressure, ready to solve the puzzle. Helen hated this type of brain teaser, but was too proud to admit to Eugenia Draper that the only reason she had brought the magazine was for the dilemma segments and was itching to turn back to the original page. From the very back of the dated bus, Helen looked around. She could see that some children were fast asleep on the old-fashioned seats that were decorated in mustard brown fabric. They were also overstimulated by all the weird and wonderful animals that they were unable to stay awake on the journey home from the primary school trip. On her left was a very sleepy 5-year-old Chloe, and next to her, playing a handheld computer, was her son. The trip had been simply magical, Helen thought. Mason looked as if his smile had been permanently pasted on his face as he raced around, dashing from one enclosure to the next, asking, "Mum, what's that?" and "Mum, can we take it home?" Both mothers were in hysterics when Chloe nearly fell over in shock as a great big baboon turned its back and showed her its shiny red behind. It had been a day to remember. It was just such a shame her husband, Douglas, couldn't come due to being snowed under with work. They were trying to save up enough money so the family could move to a bigger property and move out of the current rented 2-bedroom terrace house in town.
"So, how goes the house hunting?"
Eugenia inquired.
"I hope you're not going to move away from the area. After all, Chloe and Mason would miss each other terribly,"
she said, overly concerned. Due to Chloe's shyness, it had taken her 4 years to find another child she could socially interact with successfully, and Eugenia was going to help her child keep that friend as long as she could.
"It's looking pretty bleak. There's nothing in our price range around here, so it looks like we may have to relocate to Scotland and stay with Douglas's parents while we save,"
Helen glumly informed her. Eugenia thought long and hard for a while. Having lived in the area all her life, she knew all the locals and had some potentially positive information to divulge.
"Your husband's a builder, isn't he? Why not build your own home?"
Eugenia said, as if the solution was completely obvious. Helen McQueen looked back and, in an unimpressed tone, said, "We would, but land around here isn't exactly easy to get hold of." Eugenia smiled back smugly.
"It's not what you know, it's who you know."
Mason had now dropped his games console in his lap. He and Chloe were now both fast asleep. Helen, now intrigued, gladly reached back down and stored her magazine away, then turned to Eugenia.
"Please, do continue."
First, Eugenia gave Helen a brief history of the region, telling her that a lot of the land was used for farming and was part and parcel of Tinker's farm. When the farmer died and the farm was no longer profitable, the single remaining family member divided up the land and sold the majority of it. Mrs. Grace turned Tinker's farm into Tinker's cottage and kept most of the land around the building. There was, however, a few acres left on the outskirts of the town that Mrs. Grace sold to her cousin, who also had a farm. Last month, her cousin had passed away and was shocked when she discovered she had re-inherited the plot of land, and Mrs. Grace and her husband Geoffrey had no plans for it. The first two of the Grace children, David and Seth, had just finished university, and the youngest child, Violet, had just started. Eugenia's husband Richard worked for Mr. Grace. With the children's expensive education debts and his wife's costly hobbies, she knew the Graces would be more than happy to sell the land off quickly and relatively cheaply, and she could start the negotiations on their behalf. Helen's face lit up with amazement, as if she could finally see a light at the end of the tunnel of their housing problems.
A chance to build our own dream home. That would be incredible,
Helen said dreamily.
I knew there was a reason I liked you, Eugenia.
Eugenia looked contented.
I'll get Richard to drop it into conversation tomorrow.
The two of them spent the next 10 minutes of the journey speculating what kind of house they should build, how many bedrooms it would contain, and what the kitchen would look like. As the bus slalomed, taking consecutive narrow corners, the two chatty women and most of the other parents had slowly been rocked to sleep, just like their children. As they got closer to their destination, Mason began to stir from his slumber and let out a seemingly endless lethargic yawn, which gently woke some of the passengers, causing them to turn around to see where the noise had come from. But after a moment of silence, they slumped back into their seats. All of a sudden, the bus braked hard and skidded with a blood-curdling shriek. The force from the sudden stop launched them out of their seats, propelling the passengers into the air, waking them all up abruptly.
Oi, Nigel Mansell, shouted an aggravated Helen. What are you trying to do? Beat the rush hour traffic? Honestly, does he even know how to drive a bus?
Eugenia scorned. The bus driver was a man with a rather large protruding nose in his early 40s. He wore a pale blue shirt, charcoal grey trousers, and had shiny black shoes on his feet, which were working the foot pedals like a deranged organist. He whipped away his dark brown shabby hair out of his big, wide blue eyes and made a second brush across his face with his hand again, not because his hair was still obstructing his vision, but to wipe away the sweat of fear on his brow. The lengthy vehicle continued to slip and slide along the road as if it was slickened with oil. The spooked driver turned the wheel one way, and as soon as he had made one full rotation of the wheel, he spun it around again in the opposite direction.
Stop the bus, now!
Screamed Eugenia. Chloe, who was sat on the back centre seat, started crying, and immediately all of the other children joined her, erupting in a chorus of tears. The boy's in trouble, the bus driver yelled, as he now braced himself, slamming on the brakes and pulling out of a skid. But it was too late. The bus was travelling too fast. It continued, barrelling on, and made its way up onto a large stone bridge, leaving the noise of shrieking brakes and the choking smell of smouldering asphalt behind them. The rusty bus had finally come to a standstill. All on board inhaled a deep breath of burning rubber and let out a great sigh of relief.
Thank goodness that's over,
Helen said, reassured, but when she glanced down, she could see her hands were shaking uncontrollably, like leaves in the wind. She rose to make her way to the front of the bus, to ensure no one was injured, but instantly halted, rooted to the spot. As she got to her feet, the rear end of the bus started to dip and plunge downwards. The vehicle had come to a stop in the middle of the bridge, right on the edge. As she turned her head to peer out of the wide window, all she could see was the glorious tranquil sunset, then dark water, and a steep, rocky embankment. As the bus driver laid hunched, thrown upon the steering wheel, a few drops of blood seeped from a cut above his left eye, trickling, gathering speed as the droplets ran along the dorsum of his bulbous nose to the tip and dripped in a large globule, staining his shirt. A single pale, small hand reached under his motionless body, down by the gearbox, and pushed in a chunky red button. Whoosh! The door of the bus mechanically folded open, and all eyes darted over to see who had opened it. Little Chloe Draper froze with nerves, as everyone's gaze was now firmly upon her.
"That's it, Chloe. Run! Run as fast as you can and get help,"
Chloe's mother urged.
"No! Stay exactly where you are,"
strongly contradicted Helen.
"If she moves, it will upset the balance of the bus, and it will drop."
Eugenia's irises kept flashing in the direction of the exit, and the little girl read her mother's visual sign and bolted off the bus and onto the bridge, never looking behind her. The bus creaked in pain as it dipped backwards, and as Helen thought she was going to plummet to her death, the back end of the bus stopped and rose back up ever so slightly. Helen said forcefully,
"Right, nobody move unless I tell you."
She looked around the bus with certainty and devised an order to keep the weight of the vehicle evenly distributed. She then began in a composed voice,
"Mason, Mummy needs you to walk very slowly to the front of the bus."
But her son just sat there, perfectly still, with his little fingers digging into the padding of the fabric seat. Knowing there wasn't time for procrastination, she then told Eugenia to move, and then the next occupants of the seats directly in front of her to do the same. As people started to filter to the exit, the bus began to level out, and she instructed the parents to let the children off the bus one at a time. When it was time for the adults to get out, she started with the lightest. She ordered them to rescue the driver by retrieving him from the driver's side door. Only 2 people remained. Helen was now at the front of the bus, and her son was still in his original spot at the back and was completely unresponsive to his mother's pleas. The police and the emergency services had now arrived, and one of the firemen was begging Helen to exit first, and he would retrieve her son. The bus then unexpectedly dipped down again, and a bunch of well-built police and firemen jumped and grabbed onto the front, holding the rising vehicle, managing to weigh it down. Inside, Helen was thrown forwards and slid down the aisle, catapulting her next to her son. With the motion of the bus falling back, she sprang to her feet again. In an attempt to level it out, she grabbed Mason by the arm and rushed to the other end, but was thwarted and jerked backwards by the sheer weight of her perfectly still son. He was immovable. The front tyres of the bus hit the ground, off the bridge, and bounced back up, causing the whole vehicle to shift, lose its equilibrium, and roll back. Before she could pull Mason again, she was lifted off her feet and thrown over a muscular shoulder. Her clammy hands slipped from Mason's arm, and she was dragged off the bus, kicking and screaming. The fireman carrying Helen got free of the bus just in the nick of time, as the bus disappeared out of sight and fell to the jagged rocks below. Helen's legs turned to jelly, and she fell into the arms of the man who had rescued her. She frantically beat his hard chest with her fists and sobbed uncontrollably until all her words became inaudible. Survivors gathered together. Even though they were out of danger, they huddled their children close, winced and shuddered as they heard the bus scrape and grind on the crushing rocks below. Most jumped and hid their face in their hands when they heard the almighty splash, as the bus plunged into the deep, overriding river. This moment only took about 5 seconds to happen, but to Helen it felt like a lifetime, and with every bang, thud and crash, her body became numb. The prospect of ever holding her son drifted further and further away. Eugenia watched from the distance, as emergency lights flashed around her, not knowing whether to stay put or go and comfort her friend. Suddenly, Eugenia realised that in all the mayhem she hadn't seen Chloe since she had run off the bus to get help. She spotted her daughter's matching flaming red hair darting amongst the survivors, and ran to her, throwing her arms around the child as soon as she was in reach, giving Chloe the biggest hug she had ever had, almost crushing the thin, fragile little girl.
"Thank goodness you're okay,"
Eugenia sobbed.
"I don't know what I would do if I lost you."
As she embraced her child, she saw Helen with her arms clutched around the fireman and couldn't believe what had just happened. If it wasn't for Helen's selfless, quick thinking and decisive actions, it could have been all of them at the bottom of the bridge, but instead, all were safe except her son. She then told Chloe to stay right where she was and quickly walked over and relieved the captured fireman. She held her friend, trying to console her. The Coast Guard had now arrived with boats. Everyone on the bridge felt a sudden strong gush of air as their hair flew in every direction as a helicopter hovered above. Blonk, blonk, blonk went the divers, as they launched themselves into the water by rolling backwards off the edge of their boats.
"They'll find him,"
Eugenia assured Helen.
"They'll find him."
It had now been several minutes since the bus had hit the rocks, smashing into the water, and she was petrified on how the rescue crew would discover her precious son. With all eyes on the ominous water, waiting for the divers to surface, the last few air bubbles had stopped. Spectators were perplexed to see the divers arriving far on the other side of the bridge on the muddy shore. 3 strong men were carrying a small body. 2 had an arm each around their necks, while the 3rd held the legs. Helen saw the still body and jolted in a sudden spasm, almost knocking Eugenia aside. She ran as fast as she could to get to the other end, stumbling and veering all over the road as she went, with shaky, unresponsive legs. After what felt like the race of her life, she arrived to find Mason lying completely still, smeared in mud. Under all the muck, his skin had turned darkish bluey purple. She fell to her knees next to her son, put her head to his chest, and screamed huskily at the men.
"Help him! Why won't you help him?"
The trained paramedic diver solemnly told her that they couldn't do anything more for her son. He wouldn't respond to CPR, and they couldn't get a pulse. She placed her hands on Mason's shoulders, trying to shake him and pleading with him just to breathe and wake up. But it was no use. Her son's skin was hard and cold as ice. Another paramedic appeared on the scene, draping a heavy charcoal grey blanket around her neck, and tried to lead her away from the lifeless body. Then, not knowing if her mind was playing tricks on her, she froze. The people standing nearby gasped in shock, as suddenly the boy they had all presumed was dead sat up and screamed. They burst into a euphoric round of applause as they witnessed what they believed was a miracle. His mother span around, this time knocking the paramedic over, and sprinted to her son, and in the short few seconds it took to reach him, his darkened skin had faded and returned to a normal, healthy pink glow. "Impossible," one paramedic said, dumbfounded. A fireman asked, "How did he survive? He was under the water for so long." The other paramedic raised his shoulders up, shook his head baffled. "There must have been an air pocket still inside the bus," he guessed, and then he questioned a diver. "Why did it take you so long to bring him up?" The diver explained they had initially planned to get him to the lifeboat, but the child was so unbelievably heavy they couldn't swim to the surface with him. It took all 3 of the men's combined strength just to carry the child along the riverbed to the closest shoreline. "But just look at him," the fireman noticed. "There's not a single scratch or bruise on his body." The emergency service men stood there in sheer disbelief that one little boy could beat the odds, walk away from an accident of that magnitude completely unscathed, but were less concerned with how, and more relieved that there were no casualties. People were being loaded into another bus, bound for the hospital, so everyone could get properly checked out by the doctor. The bus driver was wheeled into the back of an ambulance, wearing an oxygen mask. He pulled it off, his big and what looked to be broken nose, and spluttered in a panic. "Is the boy okay? I had to swerve to save the boy." The mask was gingerly placed back on his face, and he disappeared from sight as the doors slammed shut. Police looked at each other and discussed with haste. "Better comb the area and see if we can find this boy. He may be injured." The bridge was a popular place where children would often come to play poo sticks and try to sell their homemade boats. The officers got into their cars and vans and proceeded to investigate the scene further. Mason and his mother rode in the back of another ambulance. As her adrenaline levels dropped, she felt utterly exhausted and closed her teary eyes, thanking God this nightmare was over. Mason, on the other hand, was bouncing around on the padded trolley, while the paramedics were trying to clean him up and keep him still until he was x-rayed. As he settled, looked out of the window, he saw the vast body of water before him, which he had just a few minutes ago sunk into. Mesmerized by the rippling surface, he recalled how he felt as the rush of water stormed the inside of the bus, how it had consumed him in an instant, and then everything had suddenly gone black. His chest quickened. He felt sick to the very core of his stomach. Scared, he lay back down on the mobile bed and shivered, as he vowed he would never go in or near the water ever again.